Hey guys, how's it going? I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, but a lot of you guys have been asking about my process from Mechabricks to Blender to Nuke, basically just how I make my animations. A lot of different questions in there, and I figured, you know what, might as well make a video to try to encapsulate all of that and to show you guys how I get stuff done. Just a quick note up front, this is not a tutorial video. I'll not be going into exactly how you get this done. I'm just going to show you generally how I get things done. Maybe a few like tips and tricks here and there, but this is not like a tutorial video for Blender, Nuke, anything like that. There's plenty of good tutorial videos out there, and I'll be happy to link to some of those if you guys have questions. But for now, this is just my process. So all my models are sourced from mechabricks.com. This is a fantastic resource for not only part design, like custom torso pieces or minifigure pieces, but also just general set building. Tons of pre-built models on this website. I am not a set builder. I like to take ones that are pre-built just for the sake of time, but I will build them if necessary. So once I get all my assets created on Mechabricks, that's when I import them into Blender. And there's two types of things I'm dealing with here. I'm dealing with rigged assets, which are often minifigures, cars, I don't know, planes, stuff like that. Anything that moves, really, that needs to be animated. And then I'm also dealing with sets, and these sets are often a lot lower poly. They don't have as many polygons or resolution as my minifigures because these things are most of the time blurred out by the camera. So I'd say the biggest question people ask me is like, how do you get good at lighting? What technique should I use? I'm a very simple guy. Pretty much if it's outdoors, I'm using an HDRI, which is basically just 3D version of light in our world. So it's kind of like a panorama, but 360 panorama, and it's also has a lot more dynamic range so that I can make it like more bright or less bright. And I generally only use that in a few area lights. Some people like to use tons of different lights in their scene. I do not. I like to use as few as possible and just maximize the render engine to get the result I want. So like if I was gonna light this scene right here, I'm gonna start with an HDRI and I think, all right, like what's my mood I'm trying to set here? The main resource I use, which you guys should use as well, is Polyhaven. Polyhaven has a ridiculous amount of HDRIs that are like 21K at max resolution, and they're all free. It's amazing. So I have a few ones I like to use. I have this Autumn Forest, which always gives a good result. Another thing I want to mention is setting up camera angles before anything. Generally speaking, after I set build, I then move on to camera positions and places in the timeline. So like if I'm like, all right, I know my first shot's gonna make a wide shot out here, then I'll make a camera line to this view and be like, all right, this is gonna be my wide shot. Then I'll set this in the timeline and be like, all right, this is my first camera here. And then later on, like at 70 keyframes or so, I'm gonna move in. Now it starts in the first camera, and then it switches to the second one. And so this is just really simple camera cuts here, all in the timeline. There's a tutorial on this as well out there, but this is what I use. Super helpful. So I'm gonna get back to lighting now. And as I said, this is like the first thing I do right after importing all the sets and stuff is get the cameras down, because that's gonna impact what parts of the set are gonna be hidden at different times. Because like I'm doing a really small set right here, but like I would be extending this, like I would probably extend the landscape and add some more trees so that way it doesn't just drop off into a void here. And you don't want all of that in the scene at one time. You want to hide different parts of it occasionally depending on the camera cut, so that way it's maximizing the GPU, so it's not like processing all those extra parts. It's also going to help render the scene faster as well. Let's just get this camera set up. I want to start with this close camera actually, and to maximize the GPU again, I'm going to hide my viewport out of here. Even if it's just off a little bit, it's going to be rendering this, so I have to keep it off completely. This way it's only rendering what's in this frame here. So I'm going to enter render view. All right, and for lighting, I like to turn on denoising, viewport denoising, because it tends to get really grainy and stuff like that. And this is a quick and easy way to see my lights. Alrighty, I've got my HDRI set. This looks really good. I'm going to import my minifigure. Now, when I'm dealing with lighting outside of HDRIs, I'm using area lights because those give the softest, most realistic shadows that you would see in real life. They're most physically accurate. And so those aren't too difficult to set up, really. I'm just basically placing a cursor somewhere and like, I'm gonna put a light over here and maneuver the light around. And then I can change the settings here. It gets a bit more complicated when I'm dealing with just character lighting. And this is usually why I think I said before in this video, I'm like, I like to do lighting after set building. That's true if it's not an animation. If it is an animation, I kind of want to push that off because this is why here. I'm going to be making a bunch of area lights like this. I'm like, all right, light my figure up here, area light here, area light here, and then I'm parenting them all to this minifigure. And then all of a sudden I have like 4 or 5 area lights that are just following my figure around the scene, and it gets just cluttered and hard to animate. I just like it a lot cleaner when I'm doing the actual animation and then I add the lighting in. But just real quick, if I was going to follow this process of doing these lights here, there's a way to link them just to the character, so that way you're not going to be affecting the rest of the scene. So you can see that this area light is affecting the scene as well, and sometimes that's what you want, but other times I just want to affect either the character or the scene. So all I have to do is select the light, go into visibility, shading, light linking, make a new collection. I can call this C1 for character 1, and then I just drag in my character collection, and now it's only affecting the character collection, which is really nice. And I can invert it as well, so it doesn't affect the character, it affects the environment. So yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with that. As I mentioned before, I'm a very simple guy. I like to keep the minimal lights required because I don't know, I like the look of simplicity. So now before I get into animation and like how I animate, I'm just going to render this scene out, and I'm going to import it into Nuke, which is my compositing software. A lot of pros use this software. It's where I add depth of field, it's where I add glare, chromatic aberration, all those sorts of things. So I'm just going to render the scene out. But a few things before I do, my camera settings are really important here. If I'm going to add like a distortion effect, I've experimented with adding it in post before and it's never been helpful. Inside of Blender is where it's at. So I just changed this camera type from perspective to panoramic, and I can just pick my millimeter, my lens, and you can see here we're getting a nice distortion around the edges. If you want the bokeh that matches that distortion, you'll have to do the bokeh in Blender. Otherwise, it's just going to be a flat distortion. Like if I really crank this up here, these pieces of bokeh are actually tilting towards the center of the camera. I think it's called cat's eye defocus in real life. And so that's a cool effect you can do, but you can only do that inside Blender at the moment. That's the way it works best. So you can't manipulate it outside of Blender once you render. Another thing I want to mention is that I'm rendering all these in EXRs, multi-layer file formats. Basically, an EXR allows you to have more information inside of an image file. That's not just the color and the transparency, but also things like mist or like Z or Z. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out. And for the sake of time, I'm going to set this to like 5 minutes because I really don't want to render this out fully. But for you guys, it's not going to take any time at all because all of a sudden we are going to be in Nuke. Now I'm going to run through my Nuke script very quickly. I'm not going to spend much time on it, mostly because actually Citrine in his video talked about how this all works. So I'm just going to run through it pretty briefly here. I'm running through this render image through a shuffle node, which basically renames all the channels from Blender, then through this color space node that converts the colors to what they're supposed to be. Then another shuffle node, and this is to rename the depth layer to depth Z, which is the format that Nuke reads. Then through an exposure, this just fixes some exposure issues through the color conversion. Then this goes through a filter mode, which helps to fix any depth of field errors. And so my depth of field I want to touch on here, this is PXF Z defocus or Z defocus. And this is like the best defocus that I've ever used in my life. I know that internally, Nuke comes with the bokeh node, which is what Paragon Labs developed for the Lego movie. But actually, this looks a lot better in my opinion. So I usually take this in, the autofocus never really works for me. So I just adjust these values until I find something that's close. There's a lot of fun features on here, and it also allows you to change the bokeh as well. So there we go. So that's my bokeh Really simple, really easy, super creamy, looks really nice. Chromatic aberration, I use the chromatic node. I think you can find this on Nukepedia, which is where you can get all your nodes for Nuke. I don't know if it changed too much here. I like to keep this at smaller values, generally too much looks crazy unless you're trying to go for that effect. Just a few of these. And yeah, this looks really nice here. It's my favorite chromatic aberration that I've found thus far. And then I sometimes use this. This adds effects like haze, astigmatism, glare, stuff like that. I generally, though, try to stay away from it because it's not quite the look I'm going for in most of my renders. This, though, the TLBM Flare, this is amazing. This, I think, is only found on the BlenderBricks server, so you're going to have to go there to download it. But without a doubt, best glare node I've found thus far. You can really play around with a lot of these values to make them work for you. I don't use them a ton because I like the minimalist look of my videos, but totally play around with them if you want. Vertical fading, also on BlenderBricks only. Join the server, you can download this. This is really quite nice. It simulates the anamorphic effect of the lens being blurred at the top and bottom of the frame. So that's pretty cool. Then over here, this is just the script I use to render out the image. I like to render in 4K. I'm also using the free non-commercial version of Nuke, so I can't actually export in 4K at once. I can, though, split this image up into multiple 1080p tiles, which is 4 1080p tiles, and then I can combine them later on into one 4K image. So that's my little workaround for that. There's a tutorial out there for that as well. But yeah, like this is my Nuke script. Really simple stuff. Some people use Nuke for color correction. I do not. I use Adobe Premiere Pro for my color correction. I've just had more experience with that, and I think it works a lot better in my opinion, but I haven't dived in too much with Nuke's color correction. But yeah, you can see this. It looks really good. It also looks pretty darn good considering I rendered this for a few minutes and I only used an HDRI, which goes to show that it's not about like how many lights you use, it's about how good you are with the lights that you do use. So yeah, that's my process for like lighting and compositing. Next up, actual animation, which I imagine a lot of you guys are here for. Animation is without doubt the longest part of the process, and everybody has different methods of how they choose to animate, what stuff to animate first. So I'm just gonna go through mine. This is not animation basics or animation 101. This is just how I animate. So as I mentioned before, there are tutorials on how to animate, like the different animation principles and stuff like that. And I'll cover a few of them in this video, but this is not primarily animation 101. This is just my process. So I animate on constants. Some people use different interpolation methods. I choose to just keep it on constants because that's kind of how stop motion is done in real life. You don't have interpolation, it's just one frame at a time. So my process is usually as follows. So I turn on auto keyframing. That way, every new move I make on the rig is automatically added as a keyframe in the timeline. And I like to start with the biggest stuff first and move on to the smaller things. And here's what I mean by that. So if I was going to have this guy like wave, when you wave, the torso kind of rocks forward and then comes back like pretty fast because you kind of lean backwards a bit. And this is something I will say, with Lego animation, all the moves and poses and stuff have to be a lot more exaggerated than what they would be in real life. Not by a lot, but there is a bit more you have to like play into it because they don't have as much articulation as we do. So I'm going to animate this torso rock first. And I usually start with the master bone, but he's not going to move for this, so I'm not going to worry about that. Also, before I start, I'm just going to add a keyframe for all the bones right before the first frame of the sequence. That way, the computer has a reference for what is the base pose. So I'm going to go to this first frame here. I'm going to speed through this a little bit so you guys don't have to wait for me to finish this. All right, I'm also animating on 2s. So that means that every other frame is animated. I don't animate on 1s inside a 12 FPS sequence. My sequence is 24 FPS so that my camera movements are smooth and my animation is blocky, so that I have to animate on 2s for that. So here's a little torso rock here. And notice I'm also easing into this, so he comes forward and it pauses for a second, then it flies out and then comes back. That's easing or bounce back as well. Those two animation principles are integrated here. And I just animate it at straight. Some people just do the block out first and then they animate the little ease in, ease out. For me, I just animate it through. So now that I got this torso rock, I'm going to get these arm rotations done. And this is why I start with the torso rock first, is because when I'm animating this arm bone, I can see that when I lean back, I can swing that arm up with the movement, which is physically accurate. It's a bit exaggerated, but that's how we do it. And this little wobble at the base is a bit extreme example of what I usually do. But like if the arm does fall, it does wobble a little bit. So that's kind of a fun little comedic thing to add occasionally. Don't overuse that. So I'm probably gonna take that out. Now you can see this stops way too fast. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna ease this to a stop. It's a little too smooth, so I might cut that last frame. I'm also gonna add a torso rock when he puts his arm down. There we go. Now, other parts of the body have to move along with it. So when he raises this arm up, this other arm should move backwards to counteract the weight of him moving his arm up. So this arm goes backwards over here at the beginning. This arm is going to go forwards just a little bit. But the effect is not going to be as extreme because you don't need to move that around that much in real life. And the nice thing about 3D animation is that I can change this. Like I feel like this right here, when he comes to, when he's put this arm back, this goes back too far. Looks pretty good. Now, there's no leg movement here. I would usually do leg movement now. I tend to work with these red bones for most walking stuff. And if he's sitting down, I would move these bones instead. But yeah, this looks really good right now. So I'm gonna move the head bone. So I was looking at you or the viewer. So now I'm thinking like, all right, what would the head be doing? The head moves kind of slightly when he gives the wave. So I think it would kind of be right there, looking slightly away. And then when he moves his head up, the head would turn slightly. Kind of look around just a little bit. There we go. I think this look back is a little too late, so I'm gonna move these keyframes back. It's really those subtle movements that add a lot. It's not too hard to go overdo on that. Like I could have the hair move a little bit too, but you don't need that much. Just these little subtle things that really add life to the animation. So now that I got that, I'm gonna move down even smaller. When the hand comes up, it should wave a little bit. There we go, looks pretty good. All right, and then is shoulder movements. So when this goes up, he might kind of take a breath. That looks pretty good. So I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on this, but this just kind of gets the basics down. By working with the big bones first before we move on to the small stuff, that way you can easily see how one bone or one body part affects the others. This is especially true in more complex movements like running or jumping, stuff like that, when they move around and you have like arms swinging, hands moving, hair moving, a torso rock, stuff like that. So it gets definitely a lot more complicated, but it's also, I don't know, I think it's a little easier to animate big to small because like I could animate a good portion of my animation first just with a torso rock or just after that with the arms. It makes it a lot more manageable. So yeah, that's really how I do my animations. It's obviously a very simplistic take on the whole process, but these are the basic principles I use, and then I just adapt them for my workflow. So yeah, I hope I answered you guys' questions in this. If I did not, drop a comment below. I'll try to get that answered for you. But once again, this is just a very general take on my process, and you should definitely try to develop your own, but if there's some aspects here that you want to integrate into your own process, totally do that. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I know this wasn't my usual video, but I hope this was some use to you. And yeah, I hope to see what you guys make.